Welcome to another episode of the Chronic Comeback podcast. This week, I'm really excited to have on the show Needhee Rathore. I'm always really excited when we're able to have a guest on the show who can share a story and shed some light about a condition that we previously not discussed on the show. Hypothyroidism is where your thyroid gland does not produce enough hormones, and symptoms can include fatigue, weight gain, muscle aches, muscle weaknesses, depression, and much, much more. Needhee herself struggled with her own issues due to this condition and a couple of others that she'll go into. And fast forward to today, she uses her own knowledge and her own story to inspire and help other thyroid warriors to begin their own journey to reclaim their health. And again, it's really, for me, it's really exciting to have someone on the show who's been through, their own journey and is now using that to help others. And it really kind of encapsulates, the spirit of what we're trying to do here and the kind of people that we're having on. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
No worries. Okay, cool. Well, if we could, take it back to before the start, the start of your, when things maybe started to go wrong a little bit. Could you tell us a little bit how life was like then? I mean, were you healthy before that? What was life like?
Yeah, I would say I grew up a pretty typical teenager. I am the daughter of immigrants, grew up in California, and at the age of 17, I was in the 12th grade. And the most important thing on my mind at that time was getting into college, but secondary to that was finding a prom dress. Was just about the biggest struggle that I had in my life. And I remember being 17, not being able to drive, and so driving my mom from shop to shop, from mall to mall, trying to find the perfect dress. And while I was trying these dresses on, my mom said to me, like, I think I noticed something in your neck, like it's getting big. And I remember thinking, I just completely wrote her off. I was like, whatever, you're so hypercritical of me. I just need to find a dress. I'm just getting fat. The world is crumbling. And I just completely wrote her off. And so, yes, I eventually found a prom dress, went to prom. I went off to university for the first time. And exactly 1 year later, that mass that my mom had seen in my neck wasn't nothing. It was a tumor that over the course of a year grew to be larger than a large egg.
Goodness.
And so 1 year later, when I came home for summer vacation, that's when my mom was like, something is wrong here. That is massive, because I hadn't seen her for a whole year at that point. And we ended up going to get it checked out. Turns out I had thyroid cancer. And that's what kind of started my health journey. And things kind of just went downhill from there.
So could you, is it localized in your thyroid? Does it ever spread? Is that a thing?
So there's different types of thyroid cancer.
Mm-hmm.
I had papillary thyroid cancer, which is also the most common.
Mm-hmm.
And basically what happened is my tumor, when it had first started, actually wasn't even on my thyroid. It was off to the side when my mom had first noticed it. And throughout the course of a year, it grew and grew, and it grew pretty much around and over my thyroid. And to the point where it started inhibiting my thyroid function.
Right. Okay.
And so that led to a thyroid surgery and having to get rid of over half of my thyroid alongside the tumor, because there was just no way where they could only get rid of the tumor without affecting the thyroid. Mm-hmm. But there are definitely different types. Some are more common than others. But I find that just with the work that I've done with my clients, I find that the occurrence of thyroid cancer is actually quite prevalent.
Mm. So I guess that your story is starting a little bit differently to a number of the others we've had, because you've got, like, I guess, more of a traditional thing, and not a good thing, but someone hears cancer and they think, oh, obviously it's horrible, and but it's normally, I can go down the traditional medical route, I can get normally that route, and a doctor will help me get rid of it. That would be my thinking anyway. Like, this is how I need to get rid of it. Could you talk us through, the feelings you had when you heard that, and then the story, the next part of the story after that?
Yeah. So at the time, I would say that at 17, 18 years old, I was like most girls, in that all I really cared about was vanity and how I looked. So prior to being diagnosed with cancer, all I had known was that I was putting on weight, and that's something I was not happy about. Right. And so being diagnosed with thyroid cancer and seeing these things, it put things into perspective. It gave me a reason as to why I was experiencing the physical symptom of weight gain. And even though it wasn't my biggest symptom, it's the one that I cared the most about. My energy levels were also going down. My hair was also falling out. But of course, all I cared about was the weight at that time. And yeah, so I remember going to a traditional doctor, because that's where my mom took me. And I ended up going through thyroid surgery, getting that removed. And I really didn't question my doctors much. To me, again, at 17, 18 years old, my script was just, if something's wrong, you go to the doctor and you do what you're kind of told to do. They recommended thyroid surgery. I was all on board. I was like, okay, I guess this needs to happen, especially when you're diagnosed with cancer and told that you have a malignant tumor and the doctor proposes to get it removed. You're kind of on board.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Right.
And well, I guess with the thinking I would always have, if there's something bad in me, I need to get it out. And so if you can get a surgery that takes that out of me, yeah, I'm all on board.
Right. Exactly.
And so so you had the surgery, how long after the diagnosis did you have the surgery?
It was pretty fast. I would say it was within the month.
Okay.
It was within the month.
Yeah.
And with that, so turns out I already kind of had developed a bit of hypothyroidism with the tumor kind of suppressing my thyroid.
Right.
And then with the surgery and getting over half of my thyroid removed, it kind of intensified that hypothyroidism. My thyroid got even slower, which makes sense considering that I got most of it removed. And so that now the cancer was gone, but it kind of opened up the gates to a whole host of other problems, such as an autoimmune form of hypothyroidism called Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And then I had full-blown hypothyroidism at the time as well. So it was kind of that one problem got solved and another got more intensified at the same time.
And what were your main symptoms at that time? You mentioned fatigue, you mentioned weight gain, hair falling out, which must have been awful. Was there anything else?
Yeah, I would say those were the big ones. Cold intolerance was a big thing, kind of just general like brain fog, forgetfulness, a lot of mood swings. I also used to be a competitive bodybuilder at the time. I used to do a lot of bikini shows. And because of my weight that changed, I actually ended up having to stop competing. And so really it was just a lot of GI issues, a lot of depression, a lot of brain fog. I always like to say the symptoms of hypothyroidism really can be all consuming when it comes to life.
And so you were 18 at this time after the surgery? Wow. I'm just trying to picture kind of, the way I was when I was 18. As you said, the main concern you have is where you're going with your friends that weekend. You don't think much further on than 6 months ahead of you, and suddenly you're forced to think, I imagine things like, am I going to have to deal with this for my whole life? So how did you deal with that initial, feeling of, I guess feeling completely overwhelmed? Like, how were you dealing with that?
Yeah, I think like most of us today, I had the internet at my fingertips. And so I just went down a Googling rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And I think that we all have the best of intentions when we do that, right? It makes complete sense to have a resource available to you to use it to better your circumstance. But what I find for myself and a lot of people that I talk to is that the internet can both be a curse and a blessing, depending on the research that you're doing, the validity of what it is that you're reading. So you really have to be able to be a filter. But back then I had no filter. So I found myself on blogs. I found myself on people who were claiming to be experts, learning about hypothyroidism, trying to hear the stories of people who had gone through the same thing. At the time, I just didn't want to die.
Yeah.
I didn't want to die, and I wanted to know that I could lose weight.
I actually saw one of your Instagram posts, and it was you giving advice to yourself as like a new person who's just been diagnosed, and it was just completely overwhelming that person with just masses and masses of information. And I completely agree that those Facebook groups, the Google the chasm that is Google of information. You could misdiagnose yourself with so many different things and mistreat yourself in so many different ways. Were you doing all of that? Like, were you having any help? It sounds like your mum was quite involved. Were you having any help in kind of directing this, or were you kind of driving this all yourself?
Yeah, so I was actually kind of on my own. I had come home for the summer, got diagnosed, got my surgery, went straight back to university, which
Oh,
was
wow.
about 12 hours away from home. And
Wow.
so I was actually quite alone throughout this entire journey. And I relied a lot on the internet, a lot on Google forums, anecdotes from people who had kind of been through something similar. And like you said, the internet is just such a vast place, and I wasn't able to actually have any discernment in the information that I was taking in. And I think that once you start going down that rabbit hole and you see multiple people saying the same thing over and over and over, you start believing it to be true,
Yeah.
right? It's one thing, like going back to the post that you were just referring, if you see one person say, here, follow these 50 rules, go gluten-free and sugar-free and do this and this and this, you're kind of just like, okay, that seems a little extreme.
Yeah.
But then you see a third person and a fourth and a fifth and a 10th and a 20th saying the same thing, you start believing it, because I didn't have anyone else in my real life to tell me otherwise.
And so university as well. I mean, university was a very, let's say, hedonistic time for me, where it was a lot of partying and a lot of, but also a lot of, working, and then, just a lot of extremities, I guess, of my life. How were you dealing with, I imagine you go to 18, you didn't know anyone there, and you were kind of having to have a social life, try and have a social life as well. Were you able to have a social life?
Yeah, so there was actually a plot twist in there. After I got back from getting my surgery done, and I was just had my hypothyroidism, a few months later, I actually lost my father unexpectedly. And again, I'm still like 18 at the time, lost my father. And 2 months after losing my father, my cancer actually came back. And tying it back to what you said about how university was, I would say that there's a lot of people that look back on university saying it's the best time of their life. It's not something I can say, to be honest. It was a really dark and lonely part of my life. I was always very introverted to begin with. I think my parents kind of raised me to be like very sheltered, in that in high school, I was only allowed to like go to school and come home, and they never really made me do anything outside of school. So I carried a lot of that with me to university. So the only thing that I used to have that was kind of my own was going to the gym and lifting. But then after being diagnosed with hypothyroidism and the cancer, well, I stopped lifting, I stopped competing. And so even like the joy of that kind of went away. Right. And so I found myself, to be honest, I spent about 3 out of the 4 years of university just really depressed and down on the floor of my dorm room, just like trying to find the willpower to make it through. And I really just took it day by day. I would say that I watched a lot of Netflix, or rather didn't really have Netflix at the time, just things on YouTube, because I was just so alone that I remember keeping my laptop open all day and just playing random YouTube videos, because it just made me feel less alone to hear people talking in the back. But I think it definitely wasn't easy during university. I think that when you have so many things go wrong, one after the other, and while you're physically alone and mentally alone, it can really take a toll on you.
Yeah.
And I feel like the mental health implications of everything that was going on was quite large as well.
It's almost like it's a bit of a vicious cycle, isn't it? Because you're creating like new trauma for yourself with the condition you've got going on, and then you somehow need to recover from this kind of trauma that you've got going on, as well as recover from your illness. And then the thought of that just feels so overwhelming. I can't imagine, if the only release you had was going and doing, the lifting and the bodybuilding stuff, which is very focused around what you look like aesthetically. Suddenly you're not able to do that. And not only that, they're throwing this symptom on, which means you gain weight, and then also you're losing hair. So, that must have been, especially, as a girl, coming into a woman at, 18 and 19, that must have just been so difficult. Did you have any, were there any friends you had that you could confide in, or were you literally just alone in that stage?
I think it was, I can't say I did.
Mm.
And it was because I just had gone, as soon as I reached university, I never really had the opportunity to make much friends because I kind of had my cancer diagnosis. My dad passed away, my cancer came back. And I never really had the time to even make those friends in the beginning that could have been there for me. So it's not that no one was willing to be there for me. I just never put myself out there for anyone to help me. And I think growing up, I always had a hard time asking for help. And I also just didn't want to be known as the girl who had cancer and her dad just died.
Yeah.
So, so that combined with the fact that I had my own single dorm room, I had no really need to interact with anyone.
Yeah.
A lot of the other girls were like doubled up or were in rooms with triples, and I was in a single room. So it made it really easy for me to kind of be reclusive the entire time.
So kind of through that 4 years, did you make any progression, or did you get worse? And if you did, like, could you talk us through that?
Yeah. So I would say for the first 2.5 years, things got worse. I would say my last year of university is when things started turning up. But I would say up until midway through year 3, things continually got worse, not just in terms of my physical symptoms, but in terms of my mental health. I kind of hit rock bottom, and one of my suite mates at the time actually ended up calling me help because she didn't know what was going on with me, but she knew that like, hey, there's a girl in this room who like never comes out, and I think something's wrong with her. Because I would run into them in the bathroom while I was brushing my teeth, and I would like always be really quiet. And she ended up calling the counselors and saying, hey, I think something's wrong with the girl in my suite. And I actually got taken to a psych ward. Yeah, so I think that girl at the time was under the impression that maybe I was suicidal, maybe I was depressed, and I think I probably was depressed, and I did have a lot of anxiety. And even though I hated her at the time, I'm glad that she took the initiative, because I would hope that someone would do that for, say, my daughter in the future if she was going through something similar. And so, yeah, things got worse. I was in a psych ward for a few days. They did a lot of testing. They wanted to see if I was mentally stable to be by myself, all of these things. And it wasn't until I got back home a few days later that I finally felt something other than like just deep sadness for the first time. I was just angry at her. That's all I felt. I was just angry. I remember just being so angry at her. I can't believe she like told the counselors. She could have reached out to me. She could have come to me first. Why was she like this? And I was just so upset because of her, I had missed an exam.
Right.
And that's all I could think about. And school was like the most important thing in the world to me. It was the one thing that I felt like I had control over, because everything else was falling apart. So I thought, okay, well, at the very least, I could get good grades, and that'll be something to live for. But because of her, I missed a test. So I hated her. And it was just so weird, because I remember thinking, wow, I haven't felt any other emotion other than grief and just feeling so down and low for so long. So it kind of felt good.
Wow. And that was kind of a bit of a turning point for you, or?
Yeah, so it was after I got over that anger. I think it lasted for like maybe 2 days, but I ran into her, talked to her. At first I was like, hey, why did you do this? But as soon as I saw her face and like saw the intention in her eyes, it quickly melted away. I understood where she was coming from. And I realized really quickly that from the outside, it could have looked like I could have been in a much worse mental place than I actually was. So I'm glad that she took the action that she did. And it was from that point that I decided that something clicked in me, and I realized that life was really, really short. Right. And I learned that through many things that had happened in my life, like losing my dad, being diagnosed with cancer twice, that life was short. And I remember watching some vloggers on YouTube that I found inspiring, just people living their best lives. You get the edited vlogs, the music in the back, everything looks phenomenal. Life looks great. And I remember thinking like, wow, like, isn't that great? Like, it just looks so good. And these same people, these vloggers at the time, started talking about gratitude. And when you watch one video, you start getting shown similar videos. So I kind of just kept being shown videos on gratitude and gratitude journaling. And everyone would more or less say the same thing, like, gratitude changed my life. My gratitude practice changed my life. And I'm like, okay, like, this all sounds great. And a lot of people were talking about how choosing happiness was like the thing to do. And so that kind of like is what got me down the spiral of like self-help, self-development, was just watching people who talked about choosing happiness. And my first instinct was, yeah, it's easy to choose happiness when you don't have a bunch of shit going on in your lives. Right. But it was through listening to other people's stories who had gone through troubles that I realized that, hey, like, maybe, just maybe, that all of these people whose videos I'm watching that are talking about gratitude and perspective, maybe there's some truth in this. Like, and maybe I can just explore it. And if it sucks, I can stop. Like, why not? Right. Everyone talked about having a gratitude practice. So I thought, okay, pull out a notebook and start writing down 3 things that you're grateful for every day. If it does nothing, then don't do it. It doesn't cost you anything.
Yeah.
Right. And so after developing that practice, I can say today, over 10 years later, that my gratitude practice and having a gratitude mindset has single-handedly changed my life.
Really?
And it's a heavy statement, but when I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer and my body was puffy and I was using brown eyeshadow to cover up like the bald spots in my hair so I could go to class, I had really hit a breaking point. I was depressed. I was stuck in a dead-end relationship. I felt trapped. I was tired of pretending that I was fine. And gratitude really gave me a perspective that I never had, or was basically shown around me. I grew up in a household that was pretty pessimistic. Optimism is not something that I ever saw in my day-to-day life. It was always like, my parents are great, obviously, but I think a lot of what I've learned from them is kind of the antithesis of what I actually wanted to be. And so everything that I learned was always like, what's the worst that could happen? How are you going to prepare for this when it goes wrong? And gratitude was the complete stark opposite of that. And it was so nice to see that, hey, if you just focus on the things that are actually good and make an effort to think about the things that are good versus what could go wrong, over time, that can actually change things. Yeah. So I would say that was really the big turning point for me.
It's really interesting you talk about that, just in terms of because I come from a UK culture is very negative. We always, if someone asks you how you are, it's always like, I'm okay, I'm not bad. If someone compliments you on something, your immediate thing is to downplay it and say, oh no, well, I didn't really deserve that, or and your immediate thing is to not kind of like accept it and actually be grateful for that. And it's interesting that you say that, because I always think of, because you grew up in California, I always think of California as being kind of like the opposite of that, and everyone being really welcoming of that kind of thing. And then if anything, actually, when someone says, how are you doing, they're like, even if they're feeling like crap, they're like, I'm fantastic, like I'm right. And but is that more down to your upbringing as opposed to kind of like your environment?
Exactly. I think it was definitely more my culture. So we come from an Indian background, and we were kind of just in our own bubble, right? And just growing up as children, we never really spent much time outside of the house. We were kind of like so yes, we were in Greater California, which is absolutely like that. Yeah. But I think, you bring up an interesting point, that with that, it's so easy to make assumptions about people, right? Just based on where they're from and things like that.
Yeah.
And it's so easy. Like there's depressed people and people that are struggling everywhere. Yeah. Regardless of how pretty the Instagram pictures are, regardless of how perfect the scenario seems, but it's so easy to overlook that. So I think it's nice to be able to be aware of kind of like these biases as well, and how what we see isn't always what is.
For sure. I really like the fact that you say that the turning point for you was something that wasn't, a drug or, a supplement or something like that. It was actually something that was a mindset shift, which I've had a lot of trouble kind of getting my head around, that could be, one of the main things for me, which I realized that kind of maybe a couple of years ago now. And I think for people listening who are still trying to force the physical to open themselves up, that their mindset shift could help them, would be amazing for them. Do you find that a lot? So with the clients you work with today, is that one of the first things you try to address, like that change in mindset?
Yeah, the mindset is really the foundation. And as a coach, I would say it's something that I'm constantly working on, helping my clients with. That being said, I also know my limitations as a person, in that I think you can guide someone to a proper mindset, but it's really taking the action that really will build it, right? It's one thing to tell someone who's depressed or down or sad to have gratitude and to like have a journal, and you can tell them a million stories about how gratitude changed your life and everyone else's. But until they take action on, say, possibly starting their own journal or doing something, it becomes really hard. So I think there's a lot of people today talking about mindset and being positive, but I think it needs to be followed up with something that's more tangible, that's more tactical. Because even though mindset work happens here, I feel like it doesn't only happen here. Like, we need to be able to do something, right? Because to tell someone to be more positive, to feel like they can do it, isn't enough.
For sure. Well, the minute you think, "Oh, I need to be positive," 5 seconds later, you're back to
Oh
that,
yeah.
initial, that initial thing, the mindset that got you there. I completely agree, and it's about those little steps, like compound interest of doing something consistently every day, for a longer period of time, and not being discouraged by the lack of progression within a short period of time. Because I think in this current day and age, we expect results so quickly. And I know I do. I always just like, if I try something and then a week later I'm like, why isn't it, why am I progressed further? But yeah, it's about having that patience, about the results will come, and I guess the faith so that was the shift for you. What else were you doing? And from that point, when you started focusing on gratitude, which must have been incredibly difficult when you've got your hair falling out, you're not feeling good about yourself, focusing on something to be grateful for. Actually, could you give me an example of what you might focus on being grateful for in that situation?
Yeah. So I think most of my life, I had never really thought about gratitude outside of Thanksgiving. Like, I
Right.
grew up at school in the States, and we'd have Thanksgiving every year, and we would like make little drawings in school and write about, like, I'm thankful for my mom and my dad and the roof over my head and food. And so whenever I thought about gratitude, it was like that same script. I'm grateful for my family, the food, the roof over my head. And so when I started my gratitude journal, that's where I started.
Mm, right.
And my only goal that I had for myself was that I had to write down 3 things every day,
Yeah.
and then I had to write a because statement.
Mm,
I truly, when I first started my gratitude journal, I truly thought that I could only maybe come up with like 10 things in my entire life. So I think it's really important to lower the barrier to entry when you're trying to start a new practice, whether it's exercising or eating healthy or even this gratitude practice. We need to lower the barrier to entry so you can actually take the action. And so my rule for myself, because I truly thought I didn't have more than 10 things to be grateful for, and I wanted to do this for at least a month.
mm,
So I told myself that I could repeat them.
yeah.
It's totally fine, but I had to write a because, and that because had to be different. So
Okay.
I could write every day that I was grateful for my mom, but then the because after that would have to be different. So it's
Okay.
kind of like the loophole that I gave myself, and that's how I started.
Yeah.
And, instead of trying to find something to be grateful for within my own body, when I thought everything was falling apart, I just completely stayed away from that altogether.
Mm,
I didn't want to say, well, I'm grateful for the fact that I have like beautiful teeth or whatever it may be. I just didn't want to even think about my body, because the second I started thinking about my body, whether it be positive or negative, the negative just so like highly outweighed the positive that it
mm,
would cause me to spiral. So I'm
yeah.
like, you know what? Just think about the other things in your life. So oftentimes I found myself just kind of going through the people in my life. And then it slowly turned into like, hey, the sun's really nice today. The weather's really nice today.
Mm,
Hey, like seeing that puppy when I was out on my walk actually was like such a fun thing to see. And it made me smile. And it kind of started trickling into other things. And I realized that these things that I used to write down in my gratitude journal didn't all need to be so serious.
yeah.
But so really what I was doing is priming the lens through which I saw the world.
Mm,
And I almost found myself like almost like a detective. I was almost looking for things to write down because I was so tired of writing down, I'm grateful for food and my mom and the roof over my head.
yeah.
I'm like, I'd like to change it up. Let's go look for these things. And so that kind of forced me to put these lenses on through
Mm,
which to see the world.
yeah. And so yeah, could you take us through that? I guess the next part of it. So you were still experiencing a lot of symptoms at this stage. Like, how did
Mhm.
you? I'm sure, kind of, you were addressing other areas of your life, and how did you do that?
Yeah, so when it came to the medical side of things, I actually did end up going down a rabbit hole. I did fall into the trap of people telling me that they could fix my hormones and I should buy these magic supplements.
Yeah.
So even though I was a broke college student, I did spend a lot of time in that place for like 3 years almost.
Wow.
I saw no progress, but I had this false sense of progress because I was constantly reading blogs. I was constantly spending money on supplements, coaches, and just like these like programs that would like heal my thyroid, heal my life, right? Like I ate that stuff up for years. And so that's kind of, even though it didn't help, it is something that I did for a very long time. I spent like 3 years of my life there.
Mm.
And it was after realizing how much money I had spent on these things and getting very clear with myself on, okay, spending money on the treatments and the supplements was something that I was okay with. But I wanted to see what I had to show for it.
Mm.
Right. So after graduating college, having like mountains of debt from school, I really just sat down with myself and wanted to see, okay, well, how much money have you spent in the last few years and what results have you gotten? How are you better now than before you started doing all of this? And it was a very hard conversation to have with myself because I realized not much has changed at all.
Mm.
I had like this false sense of productivity. I had this false sense of progress. And my mindset was to the point where I just thought that I had to find the next magic pill. And just because I had tried these like 20 pills that didn't work, maybe the 21st would be it.
Yeah.
Right. And so from that, I realized I wasn't going to spend any more money. And I just kind of made the decision at that point to go back to my roots. So my educational background is in neuroscience and biochemistry. And like, that's what I studied. Like at the base, I was a scientist. And I also worked in a lab and did a lot of scientific research as well. But for some reason, when it came to my own health, I wanted to do all these woo-woo things. And so I told myself, okay, why don't you just run an experiment? I never tell myself I'm going to do something forever
Mm.
because forever is a scary place. To say that you're going to do something always or never those are very absolute words. So I just told myself, just like the gratitude journal, try it for a month. I just did the same thing when it came to nutrition and wellness. And I said, hey, why don't you do this? Why don't everything you implement, like for the next 2 months, just make sure it's backed in science? That's it. If you find a supplement or like some magic product that like promises you the world, you can buy it. Just look into the science behind it first. And that's kind of where I would say like my science-backed research journey kind of began. And that's when that's when things started going up because I still continued coming across a lot of supplements, a lot of products, a lot of people that claim that they could help me. But then when I would ask them the right questions, a lot of them would disappear because there wasn't anything to really back the claims that they were making. And
Mm.
I thought, aha, this is so weird. And so just by the nature of telling myself I was going to look at the research, it kind of, all of like the fluff kind of just fell away. And I think it made me smarter as a patient, right?
Mm.
It helped me become a lot more self-reliant. And because all like that extra fluff came away, I was left with like the fundamentals, which is something that I had never really paid attention to. I was so busy looking for like the magic pill that I realized I wasn't even following the fundamentals of nutrition, right? Like eating enough vegetables or moving my body in an okay way, or like having enough protein, balancing my plate. All of these things I had neglected because I assumed the answer would be so much more complicated because my situation was complicated.
Mm. So what was it for you in that approach, in this new approach, that gave you the most gains, do you think?
Yeah, I would say it's not even sexy. I know people don't like hearing this, but I think it really started off with eating more minimally processed whole foods
Yeah.
and fewer highly processed refined foods, which seems really, really simple. But at the time, everything that I had read online said that I could only eat whole foods, that you could never eat processed foods. So just that switch from an all or nothing mindset to an 80-20 mindset really made a massive difference.
Mm. That's actually really, because I was speaking to a practitioner I'm dealing with at the moment, said kind of in the first 3 months, try and do it as close to 100% as you can, and then switch to kind of like 90-10. And as soon as she said that, I was just like, oh, that is just a lot more comforting, or like, 80-20, because trying to be perfect all the time is just unrealistic and actually just quite stressful. So like, do you feel that having that, I guess my problem is that, and no, I haven't done it yet, but if someone gives me that 20%, I'm like, what am I going to do with that 20%? Am I going to be, how bad could I be with that 20%? But is it a case of, with that 20%, you're not taking it to an extreme where you're going and having an ice cream, all of that kind of thing, but you're allowing yourself to have, things that aren't quite with the plan, but they're still not really bad for you?
Right. So, there's multiple ways to go about like the 80-20 rule, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And there's many ways that we can divvy this up, right? So some people, like, one way to look at 80-20 very simply is that in 10 days, have 8 of them be perfect and have 2 be off. That's one way you could do it, right? Or and that's kind of like the cheat day model, right? Of like, be perfect for this many days and then like have a blast the others. The way I like to do it is I knew that if I didn't include whole foods into my day-to-day consistently, I just felt bad. And that's something I learned from experimenting and taking action. So instead of having, like, say 8 days great and 2 days that were bad, I just decided, like, hey, if, like, I used to count calories at the time. So calorically, I was like, hey, I want over 80% of my calories to come from nutrient dense sources, and I'll leave about 15% to be more ancillary. And I'll, like, leave those for chocolate or whatever else it may be that brings me joy.
Yeah.
And so that was the approach that I took. And I would say the process has kind of been refined throughout the years, but I would say it's pretty close to where I am today.
Wow. Okay. And aside from that, so do you think, like, just diet alone, gratitude, like, was there anything else you were doing as well, in addition to that?
Yeah, actually this is huge, especially for anyone that's listening that has hypothyroidism. I think I would like to take a little bit of time to speak about thyroid medications. So I am not a doctor. This is not medical advice, but as someone that has hypothyroidism, that has Hashimoto's, that's worked with nearly 1,000 women that have hypothyroidism as well, I do want to say that it's incredibly important that you take your thyroid medications. There's no amount of food in the world or gratitude in the world that is going to make thyroid hormone in your body that you do not have. And so just to explain this a little bit further, let's just say if you are somebody with an iron deficiency, for example, you could eat iron-rich foods and get more iron, right? Or if you're vitamin D deficient or calcium deficient, in theory, you could rely on foods to get those numbers up to a degree, right? When you are hypothyroid and your levels are suboptimal, there's nothing that you can eat that'll make thyroid hormone. Only your thyroid can make thyroid hormone. You can do things to support your thyroid, like manage your stress, get enough sleep, all of those things, but there's nothing that you can consume to directly produce more thyroid hormone. And I noticed that because hypothyroidism is a lifelong condition, a lot of patients are nervous about having to take a pill forever. And as someone that was diagnosed at 17, I completely understand that. The thought of being, like, really, really young and thinking that, like, man, I need to take this medication forever can be a little scary, right? And it can feel like you're sick or a patient. But, if anyone ever feels like that, I want you to pause and ask yourself, why are you taking this medication? And when you learn what this medication is doing for you, you can start taking away some of that stigma, right? You would never, like, there's children in the world who are born with asthma, right? But they're born with it. And so they don't judge themselves for needing an inhaler because they very much need that. And so I worked with little kids. I've worked with clients that have kids who have asthma, and there's no judgment behind that. And so when it comes to your thyroid medication, what I want you to understand is that your thyroid hormone is vital to your entire body functioning properly. It's so easy, because hypothyroidism often results in weight gain, to feel like, oh, well, hypothyroidism makes me fat and makes my hair fall out and it gives me no energy. Okay, yeah, it does those things, but that's not all your thyroid does. Like, your thyroid very literally controls so many of the functions in your body. And if you don't have enough thyroid hormone, it can lead to a whole plethora of things that are much worse than weight gain and hair loss, right? So a sluggish thyroid can increase your risk for elevated cholesterol, for heart problems, for like peripheral neuropathy, for infertility, for frequent miscarriages, for birth defects. This is why you need to take your thyroid medications. This is why people with hypothyroidism benefit from nutrition and lifestyle changes, even if those changes don't lead to significant weight loss.
So I also imagine you get a lot of people that, and this is me asking the question, but who take their medication religiously, but they don't do any of the other changes and they still have all of the problems. Would that be right?
Yes, this is actually something I see quite often. I will often see there's always two extremes to different views, right? On one hand, I have people that will message me every day saying, how do I get off my thyroid medication? In which case I'll say, hey, that's outside of my scope of practice, but I can help you feel better while you're on your medications. And on the other end, we have the people that are just like, well, hey, I'm taking my medication, so I don't need to do anything else.
Yeah.
And whenever our views are very, very strong in one extreme, we really need to be able to kind of find that middle ground.
Yeah.
Right. And so I will say that it really, and the way I like to say it is, as a fat loss coach, fat loss isn't the most important thing in the world. Like weight loss isn't the most important thing in the world. What I care about is that you feel good enough to live the life that you want to live, whatever that looks like for you. Right. And for a woman, like the reality is like how we look and how we feel in our bodies directly does affect how we show up in the world and the things that we go after. And so that's why I do teach weight loss, yes, but it always has to be in the context of deeper health, because there is no point in weighing 10 or 20 pounds lighter if your quality of life suffers. So the whole point of all of this, the whole point of the medication, the whole point of the nutrition and the lifestyle is really, truly, and ultimately to increase the quality of your life.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting you just said that, because I was thinking that, so when I created this podcast, it was like, oh, could it be just interviewing people who have made this full recovery and it's, it's miraculous and it's, it's amazing and we can celebrate that. And then actually it was more people who are actually loving their life and enjoying their life. Yeah, they may need to take a medication, or yeah, they may still be in pain, or yeah, they may have some aspects of, their illness that they have to deal with. But despite that, they're absolutely in love with life and they've gone on to achieve amazing things in their life, and are a great example to people who've never been through chronic health issues, because they're actually happier than they are because of what they've been through. And so I think it's a really cool message that you're putting out there, in terms of you may still be on your medication, but that's not the goal here. The goal is quality of life. I really like that. And so what is your quality of life like today? Like, how are your symptoms? Like, what is it? What is life like for you?
Yeah, I love what you just said. When it comes to medications, again, like put simply, I don't care if I'm on medications or not. I just want to live a great life. Right. And I would say today, I would say that I am living my definition of what my best life is. I mean, I live here in Japan. I am a major foodie, so I'm able to travel all around, eat all the foods. I'm able to run a pretty successful business from across the world. And I spend over 13 or 14 hours working every day because I love it. And I have the energy to do so. Right. And so to me, that is my best life. And that's not to say that I have enough energy to work that much every single day, but on most days I do. And you know what, there's some days where it's like, hey, you know what, today's going to be like a normal 8-hour workday. And listening to that and not beating yourself up, I think has really been the key. Right. And so I think back in the day when I was really struggling, I viewed my health and wellness like a switch, like a light switch that was on or off. Like it was a good day or a bad day. But now today, I think the mindset has really changed in that I view it a lot like a dial. Right. I would say most of my days are like 8, 9s, and 10s. But when it ever dips down to maybe a 6, that's when I like start to like rest and recover, because I never want to get worse. And I mean, as someone that has a chronic health issue as well, I'm sure you can relate to this. It's a lot harder to get back up to an 8 when you're at a 1. So it's
Yeah.
better to not let it get down that low to begin with. And
Mm.
I think that some people have the mindset of like, well, I'm still coasting at a 6. It's fine. Once I burn out, then I'll rest. But it's the wrong strategy, I think, when you have a chronic illness,
Mm.
right? So much of it really comes down to what I like to say is like working with your body and not against it.
Yeah.
That learn to get in tune, learn to listen, so that when things do get quote unquote bad or worse, or when your dial does dip down from like an 8, 9, 10 to maybe a 5, 4, like a 5 or a 6, you're able to see and notice those things. So then you can take action, right? We want to live normal lives, but living a normal life with a chronic condition does involve you being more aware than someone who doesn't have a chronic condition. And that's totally okay.
Yeah, definitely. So what would be your advice to someone right now who is in the, I think you mentioned you kind of reached breaking point earlier on in your story. What would be your advice to someone who is at breaking point right now? Whatever, someone could be listening to this with a different chronic health issue or the condition that you were dealing with. From a mental point of view, what's your advice to them and how they could keep going and get to where you are today?
Yeah. When you have a chronic health condition, when you have hypothyroidism, it's these points where you feel so out of control, right? That's the thing that really brings that desperation, that like really sad energy of like feeling like you have no control. And during this time, I think the best thing that we can do is focus on the things that we do have control over. And this is where I like to start with my clients. So oftentimes these things look like your self-talk, the way you respect and care for your body, the way that you're eating, the way that you're sleeping, what you're doing to de-stress, whether you're moving your body or not, and what else you're doing to support your efforts. So maybe bringing on a nutrition coach, maybe bringing on a personal trainer, maybe someone to help you take action, right? And so the way I like to talk to my clients is there's a lot that's not within our sphere of control. So let's just reframe this and let's just acknowledge the fact that like the stuff that's out here, we can't control, period, point blank. That's it. You just can't. But let's consider what's in our sphere of control, right? So within our sphere of total control, we will always have our actions, our mindset, and our effort, right? And then after that, we have our sphere of some control. So maybe that's like your schedule or your home or work environment, maybe a little bit of COVID, not so much. And then we have our sphere of no control, right? And I think that when we take our energy and funnel it to the things that are within our control, it leads to a happier life. It leads to more confident people because it's taking action that builds your confidence, right? It's taking action that builds your competence, and it's taking action that leads to the results that you ultimately want, right? I have spent so many years of my shortish life being depressed and doing nothing, like years. Cumulatively, I know it's years, right? And I can say with all of those years that I've spent on the floor, just being really depressed and hopeless, none of it's really ever helped me, right? But you know what I will say has helped me is like, hey, all the times that I was feeling down and didn't want to cook anything healthy, but I blended up a protein shake anyways, I think I've almost always felt better because I felt like I did something for myself.
Yeah.
Right. And so when you start taking action, it really builds that body of evidence that, hey, you know what, this kind of sucks, but I'm worth it. So I'm still going to take this action. And it's that accumulation of action that over time leads to where we want to be. The sad thing is that it takes taking action to get there. And we all want results yesterday.
Yeah, it's interesting. So people quite often have the opposite approach, don't they? Their natural, their resting state is to focus on what they can't control and to let go of the things that they can control. So I think that's great advice, and it's definitely speaking to me and what I try to deal with on a daily basis. So my final question, you talked about gratitude, which I think's amazing. It's a practice that I have every day, and it certainly resonates with me. I'm going to add that little because thing in there, though. That's not something I've done before, so thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
What are you grateful for now, having been through what you've been through? You went through a horrific time at university, your father passing away, going through, cancer, but then also chronic health issues, which have, I imagine, dominated much of your 20s. If there was a magic pill to kind of take that all away and you had, you went down a different route, you could have had a completely different life. What are
Mhm.
you grateful for, like now, with the life you have now, over potentially, what could have been?
You know, I often get told from people that I'm like an old soul, and I think that that comes from having ran into so many challenges,
Mm.
right? And so I think I'm grateful for the work that I was forced to put in, because I think with all of the life circumstances that came my way, there was two options, right? You sink or you swim, and I can't swim. And I kind of had to learn how to do that. And I think that's what I'm the most grateful for, right? I'm grateful that with this, I've been able to learn what true success looks like to me. Like to me today, despite like the whole world comparing themselves to everyone else on Instagram and on Facebook and all of these things, I'm grateful that through these challenges I've learned that, hey, you know what, success to me isn't beautiful pictures with my husband or new followers or views on a video, right? To me, like today, success is being able to acknowledge that in the face of real challenges, I can do anything I choose, because I don't deny or become defined by my troubles.
Mm.
Like the ability, like I can face whatever trouble comes my way. I can sit with it. I can understand it. I can allow the challenge to become my greatest ally. And I
Mm.
can turn that pain into a superpower instead of a crutch, right? That I can almost have like a staring contest with fear, and I can win every time,
Yeah.
right? And I think this absolutely does take training and self-awareness. But if you follow my work, or if you're listening to this, I just want everyone to know that you are closer to crushing it than you know,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
I think that's what I would say I'm the most grateful for, is knowing that, hey, no matter what transpires, I'll be okay.
Mm. Yeah, it's that mindset. You talking about it. You're getting closer to crushing it. Like, I remember thinking every day I'd wake up and I'd be like, oh, is this ever going to get better? Like, oh, why do I feel like this? This another day like this. And then I remember reading something that said, actually, you should think about it. I'm one day closer to where I'm looking to be every day, and that's kind of, I do try to tell myself a lot closer every day. I'm closer. Every dead end I come up against, that's a dead end I don't have to experience again, because I know not to go down that route. And it's actually, I'm like, yeah, like what you just said was, I'm being forced to be a better person. Like there's no other there's no other choice, and I'm gonna learn my lesson eventually, so I might as well learn it sooner. And I think that taken me, I think some people, when they're going through chronic health issues, I speak to people, or particularly when I've gone and got treatment and stuff, who've been experiencing this stuff for like 30, 40 years.
Mhm.
And these are people who probably in the first 20, 25 years did not acknowledge, what needed to get done. So I think it's amazing that you've done that. I was going to say so quickly, but obviously 10 years is a very, very long time. But yeah, look, thanks so much for coming on. It's been amazing. I think, your positivity and realism, is just super inspiring for me, but also I know for everyone who'd be listening. If people want to connect with you, potentially work with you, or just connect with you, and maybe just, ask you any questions about stuff you've raised today, how would they best do that?
Yeah. So my favorite place to hang out is on Instagram. So you
Yeah.
can find me at Hypothyroid 365. And as of July 2021, you can also find me at hypothyroid365.com.
Okay, cool. Have you set yourself your deadline that your website has to be live by
Yes.
July?
Yes. It's going live on July 1st.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I'll include all those details in the show notes, so yeah, everyone will have access to that. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on. And yeah, I'll speak to you very soon.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.